The morning sun rose softly over the peaceful grounds of Arlington National Cemetery. The air was still, and the only sound was the slow, steady footsteps of a soldier marching beside the tomb of the unknown soldier. That soldier was Staff Sergeant Michael Evans. Dressed in his perfect uniform, his white gloves shining against the dark blue of his coat, he moved like a machine built for honor. Each step, each turn, each click of his heel was done with flawless precision. To the visitors watching, he was a symbol of respect. A silent guardian standing watch for the soldiers who never returned home. His eyes never moved, his face never changed. Even under the blazing summer heat or the bitter cold of winter, he never broke his discipline. He was part of the Old Guard, one of the most respected units in the entire U.S. Army. His duty was not just a job, it was a sacred promise. Yet behind the sharp uniform and emotionless face, Michael Evans was not just a soldier. He was a man with memories, dreams, and a heart full of quiet emotion. Beneath that calm surface, there was a deep hidden story, one that very few people knew. Michael had once been a musician. Long before he ever carried a rifle, he had carried a violin. He grew up in a small town in Virginia, surrounded by fields, oak trees, and the sound of his father's laughter. His father, Thomas Evans, was a Vietnam veteran who had come home with scars, both visible and invisible. But even though his father rarely spoke about the war, he found peace in music. Every evening when the sun began to fall, Thomas would take out his old wooden violin and play gentle tunes on the porch. Michael, as a small boy, would sit beside him, listening with wide eyes. One evening, when he was 6 years old, his father handed him the violin and said, "Music can speak when words can't." That became the lesson Michael would carry for the rest of his life. From that day on, music became their bond. While other kids played football or watched cartoons, Michael spent hours learning the strings, his small fingers pressing carefully as his father guided him. His favorite memory was the sound of their two violins playing together, the slow rise and fall of melody echoing through the quiet countryside. When Michael was 13, his father fell sick. The doctors said it was a condition related to the chemicals he was exposed to during the war. The hospital became their second home. Even on the hardest days, his father would ask him to play. "Keep the music alive," he would whisper. The night before he passed away, Thomas gave his violin to Michael and said, "Promise me you'll play at least once every year, to remember." Michael nodded. He made that promise from his heart. After his father's death, music became his comfort. He played at school events, in church, and sometimes alone under the stars. Every note was a way of keeping his father close. His mother said he played like someone much older, as if his violin could talk. But as time passed, life began to pull him in another direction. In high school, Michael joined the junior ROTC program. He had always admired soldiers, their strength, discipline, and sense of purpose. When he turned 18, he enlisted in the Army. His mother was proud but worried. She handed him the violin case and said softly, "Never forget who you are." During basic training, he carried that violin with him from base to base, but soon the demands of military life left little room for music. His days were filled with drills, commands, and long hours of work. Slowly, the violin stayed longer and longer in its case. Then came the day he was assigned to the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment, the Old Guard. It was one of the highest honors for a soldier. Their duty was to protect and maintain the tomb of the unknown soldier, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. The training was intense. Every motion had to be perfect. The uniform had to be spotless, the timing exact, the movements memorized to the second. At first, Michael struggled. One small mistake meant starting all over again. The instructors demanded silence, focus, and absolute respect. There was no room for emotion. But over time, he learned to move like the others, smooth, silent, and precise. He learned to breathe in rhythm with his steps, to turn at exactly 21 paces, and to carry his weapon with unmatched dignity. On his first day standing guard, he felt the weight of history pressing on his shoulders. The marble tomb stood bright and white against the green grass. The engraving read, "Here rests in honored glory an American soldier known but to God." As he marched, he thought about the unknown soldiers buried there, men who had mothers, fathers, brothers, and dreams that were never fulfilled. He thought about his father, too, and the promise he had made. In that moment, standing in silence, Michael realized that his duty was more than a job. It was a living song, one that didn't need words or music to be heard. Days turned into months and months into years. Michael became one of the most disciplined guards in his unit. He never missed a shift. He never spoke out of turn. He was known as the silent soldier among his peers, calm, steady, and respectful. But when his shift ended, when the sun went down and the tourists left, he often sat in his small barracks room staring at the old violin case resting under his bed. Dust had gathered on it. He hadn't opened it in almost 10 years. Sometimes, late at night, he could almost hear the sound of his father's violin, soft and distant, like a memory carried by the wind. The world saw a soldier, but deep down he was still the boy from Virginia who played for his father on the porch. One rainy evening, after a long day of duty, he found himself unable to sleep. The storm outside reminded him of the nights when he and his father would play to the sound of thunder. He reached under the bed and pulled out the old violin case. The leather was cracked, and the metal locks were slightly rusted. When he opened it, the familiar scent of wood and resin filled the room. He touched the strings and they felt cold and stiff. His fingers hesitated, unsure if they still remembered the notes. Slowly, he lifted the bow and drew it across the strings. The sound was rough at first, uneven, but with every note, something inside him began to wake up. In that quiet moment, he wasn't Sergeant Evans, the perfect soldier. He was just Michael, a son, a musician, and a man remembering a promise. He didn't know it yet, but that small decision, to pick up his violin again, would soon lead him to a stage that would move an entire nation. At that time, though it was only a whisper in his heart, he put the violin back carefully and looked out the window toward the dark horizon. Lightning flashed for a brief second, lighting up the fields beyond the cemetery. He could almost see his father standing there, smiling proudly. Michael saluted the empty night and whispered softly, "I haven't forgotten, Dad." Then he sat down on his bunk, closed his eyes and listened, not to the storm, but to the silent song that had lived inside him all along. Days passed and life at Arlington continued with its quiet rhythm. Every morning, Staff Sergeant Michael Evans woke up before sunrise, polished his shoes until they shone like glass, and pressed every line of his uniform until not a single wrinkle remained. He moved through each day with calm focus, his every action precise. From the outside, he looked like a man who had mastered peace, but inside there was an emptiness he couldn't quite name. He had picked up his violin again after many years, but only in secret. Late at night, when everyone else was asleep, he would close the door to his small barracks room and play softly so no one could hear. The sound was uneven at first. The bow scratched, the strings buzzed, but as the weeks went by, the music began to return. His fingers remembered what his heart had never forgotten. The violin gave him something the silence of duty never could: a voice. One weekend, he went to a small coffee shop near the cemetery. He often stopped there for a cup of tea after his shifts. That day, as he waited in line, a flyer on the wall caught his attention. The bright red letters read, "America Honors You, a national talent show for veterans." He took a step closer and read the smaller print. It was a televised event that celebrated veterans who had hidden talents: singers, dancers, painters, poets. The show's goal was to honor service through art. The event would take place in Washington, D.C., just a few miles away. Michael stared at the flyer for a long moment. His heart began to beat faster. For 10 years, his violin had been a secret, a piece of his past he never shared with anyone. He had never thought of performing again, especially not on a stage. But something about the words "honor through art" made him think of his father. He folded the flyer neatly and placed it in his pocket. That night, he couldn't stop thinking about it. As he cleaned his rifle and polished his shoes for the next shift, the question kept echoing in his mind. Could I do it? Could I really play again in front of people? Part of him felt foolish. He was a tomb guard, a man of silence and duty. Music didn't belong in his world anymore. Yet, another part, the small boy who once played duets with his father on the porch, whispered back, "Maybe it's time." After several days of quiet thought, he finally made up his mind. He decided to enter the show, but Michael didn't tell anyone. Not his friends in the unit, not his family. He registered online late at night using his personal email. The form asked for a short description of his act. He typed carefully, "Instrumental tribute, solo violin performance in honor of fallen soldiers." He clicked submit, then sat back, staring at the screen. A strange mix of fear and peace settled inside him. Over the next few weeks, he began to practice in earnest. Every night after his shift, he would open the violin case and play quietly. The room would fill with music, soft, calm, and full of heart. He wrote and rewrote melodies, searching for one that truly expressed what he felt. Nothing seemed right at first. One tune was too sad, another too proud. He wanted something that could speak for every soldier, those who returned home and those who never did. One night, after hours of playing, he finally found it. A simple, slow melody came to him, almost like a whisper from somewhere deep inside. It rose and fell like a heartbeat, steady, sorrowful, and proud. When he finished, he sat in silence for a long time. He named it The Last Watch. Every time he played it, he thought of his father standing by the porch, of the men and women he honored every day at the tomb, and of the promise he had made long ago to remember through music. When the day of the audition came, Michael took leave from his duties and traveled to the event hall in Washington. He carried his violin case like a sacred object. Inside the building, hundreds of veterans filled the waiting area, some dressed in uniform, some in civilian clothes. There were singers warming up, dancers stretching, painters setting up easels. Everyone looked nervous yet proud. When Michael's name was called, he walked toward the small stage set up for the first round of auditions. The lights were bright and the judges sat behind a long table, their faces calm and focused. He stood there for a moment, unsure what to say. One of the judges smiled kindly. "Sergeant Evans, please tell us what you'll be performing today." Michael's voice was quiet but steady. "I'll be playing a violin tribute for the fallen. It's called The Last Watch." The room grew still. He lifted the violin, positioned the bow, and closed his eyes. The first note echoed softly. It trembled like a memory coming to life. Then the melody began to unfold, gentle and full of emotion. His fingers moved gracefully and the sound filled every corner of the room. The judges leaned forward, listening carefully. It wasn't just music. It was emotion, history, and honor woven together. The melody rose like a soldier standing tall, then fell like a flag lowered at sunset. By the time he reached the final note, the room was silent. Even the other contestants stopped what they were doing to listen. When he finished, Michael opened his eyes and lowered the violin. For a moment, no one spoke. Then one of the judges whispered, "That was beautiful." He simply nodded and saluted before leaving the stage. He didn't wait for applause. For him, the performance wasn't about winning or losing. It was about keeping a promise. A few days later, he received an email that began with the words, "Congratulations. You've been selected for the national broadcast." Michael stared at the screen, his heart pounding. He sat back in his chair, unable to speak. He had never sought fame or attention. All he ever wanted was to serve, first as a soldier and now maybe as a musician once more. As the national show date approached, he practiced every day. His friends in the unit noticed something different about him. He seemed lighter, more at peace, though none of them knew why. Sometimes they would find him sitting quietly under a tree near the cemetery, looking out at the rows of white headstones. They didn't ask questions. They respected his silence. The night before the show, he went back to the tomb one last time before leaving for the event. The sky was clear and the air was calm. He stood there in silence, his rifle by his side. The tomb glowed faintly under the moonlight. He whispered softly, "Tomorrow, I'll play for all of you." Then he placed his hand on the marble surface, a gesture of respect, of promise. As he walked away, he didn't feel nervous anymore. He felt ready. He knew that no matter what happened on that stage, he had already fulfilled something much greater. He had found his way back to the music, back to the memory of his father, and back to the part of himself he thought was lost forever. The big day finally arrived. It was early morning in Washington, D.C., and the city buzzed with life. Cars moved quickly along the streets, people hurried to work, and banners for the show "America Honors You" waved gently in the breeze. For most people, it was just another day, but for Staff Sergeant Michael Evans, it was something far greater. He woke before sunrise, just as he did every morning at Arlington. The habit was too deep to break. The hotel room was quiet, and the violin case sat on the small table beside his bed. He stared at it for a long moment, his hands resting on his knees. This wasn't a battlefield, but his heart raced like he was preparing for one. He stood up, took a deep breath, and began his usual morning routine, pressing his uniform, polishing his shoes, checking every small detail. He decided to wear his tomb guard uniform for the performance. To him, it wasn't a costume. It was a symbol, a reminder of every silent hour he had stood watch over the unknown soldier. As he adjusted his gloves, he looked at himself in the mirror. The reflection staring back was calm, but his eyes carried a quiet fire. "Today," he whispered softly, "I play for them." At the auditorium, the backstage area was alive with sound and motion. Singers were rehearsing, dancers stretching, and technicians checking lights. The air was full of nervous excitement. Michael arrived quietly, carrying his violin case like it was a treasure. When he gave his name to the event assistant, she smiled. "Oh, you're the tomb guard violinist. Everyone's talking about your audition. The judges loved you." Michael smiled politely and nodded. He didn't feel like a performer. He was just a soldier trying to keep a promise. As the show began, contestants performed one after another. The stage lights flashed, the cameras rolled, and the crowd cheered for each act. Backstage, Michael waited silently, watching through a small monitor. He wasn't thinking about the judges or the cameras. He was thinking about his father, about the soldiers whose names were lost to history, and about the quiet honor of service. Finally, his name was announced. The host's voice echoed across the stage. "Next, we have a very special performance from Staff Sergeant Michael Evans, a tomb guard from Arlington National Cemetery." The crowd clapped politely as he walked onto the stage. His polished shoes tapped softly on the wooden floor. The stage lights glowed warm and golden. He stood in the center, tall and composed, holding his violin. The judges watched with interest. One of them, a retired Marine, adjusted his glasses. Another, a music teacher, smiled gently. Michael looked out into the crowd, hundreds of faces staring back at him. For a brief moment, he felt a flicker of fear, but then he remembered the stillness of the tomb, the peace that came from silence, and the promise he had made to his father. He took a slow breath, placed the violin under his chin, and began to play. The first note floated through the hall like a whisper. It was soft and trembling, like the quiet before dawn. The melody moved slowly at first, each note carefully placed, each sound full of meaning. The audience leaned in, almost holding their breath. As he played, the music began to grow. Stronger, deeper, more powerful. It spoke of courage and sacrifice, of soldiers standing watch through rain and snow, of mothers waiting for sons who never returned. It spoke without words, but everyone in the room understood. The song rose higher, reaching a point where the sound filled the entire hall. Then it fell again, gently like a flag being lowered at sunset. The piece was called The Last Watch, and every note carried a story. When the melody reached its center, Michael's eyes filled with emotion. He saw flashes of memory in his mind. His father smiling on the porch, the gentle rustle of leaves, the glow of the violin under the evening sun. He saw the endless rows of white stones at Arlington, the silent soldiers who kept watch even in death. The music became his voice, his prayer, his salute. The audience sat frozen. The judges, usually calm and composed, were visibly moved. The retired Marine's hand trembled as he wiped his eyes. The music teacher closed her eyes, listening deeply, her lips pressed together to keep from crying. Every person in the hall could feel it. The sincerity, the love, the respect flowing through each note. When Michael reached the final line of the song, the melody slowed to a soft, fading hum. The bow rested gently on the strings. Then silence filled the room, deep, full, and powerful. For a few long seconds, no one moved. No one even breathed. Then the audience rose to their feet. The sound of applause filled the hall like thunder. Some people clapped. Others stood silently with tears in their eyes. Michael lowered his violin and gave a perfect military salute. He didn't smile, didn't bow. He simply stood tall, honoring the silence once more. The host came onto the stage, his voice shaky. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said softly, "that was Extraordinary, the judges were speechless. Finally, the Marine judge leaned forward and said, "Sergeant Evans, I've seen many performances in my life, but this was more than music. You reminded us why we serve, why we remember." Michael nodded respectfully and stepped off the stage. Backstage, some of the other contestants approached him, shaking his hand, thanking him. But he barely heard them. His heart was calm. For him, the performance wasn't about the applause. It was about the moment, the chance to speak through his music to honor those who couldn't. He sat alone for a while in the dressing room, the violin resting across his knees. The applause still echoed faintly from the stage, but he wasn't thinking about fame or judges. He was thinking about his father. He whispered quietly, "I did it, Dad." Then he smiled for the first time in a long while. It wasn't a smile of pride, but one of peace, the kind that comes when a promise has finally been kept. After the show, Michael walked outside. The night air was cool, and the city lights shimmered across the reflecting pool nearby. The world felt quiet again, just like Arlington. As he looked up at the stars, he thought about the unknown soldiers, the ones whose names no one knew but whose sacrifices built the peace around him. He knew that wherever they were, they would have heard his song. He didn't need a trophy or a prize or even recognition. He had already won something far greater, the chance to turn silence into remembrance and duty into music. And though he didn't know it yet, that performance would soon reach millions. Someone in the audience had recorded it. By morning, his video would spread across the internet, and people all over the world would learn about the tomb guard who made the judges cry with his violin tribute. But at that moment, under the quiet Washington night, Michael Evans wasn't thinking about fame. He was simply a soldier, walking home with a violin in his hand and peace in his heart. The morning after the show, Washington, D.C. was quiet but full of life. Streetcars rattled down the tracks, office workers hurried along the sidewalks, and tourists strolled near monuments and memorials. Yet in the homes and offices of millions across the country, one story was quietly beginning to spread. The story of Staff Sergeant Michael Evans, the tomb guard whose violin tribute had moved everyone to tears. Backstage, Michael had gone straight to his hotel room after the performance. He hadn't stayed to watch the other acts or to wait for results. He didn't need applause or validation. The act itself had fulfilled him. He sat on the edge of the bed, resting the violin on his lap, and replayed the melody in his mind. Each note, each rise and fall, each subtle pause felt sacred. For the first time in years, he felt completely at peace. But soon, peace was replaced with curiosity. His phone buzzed. One notification, then another. The first was from his sister, sending him a message. "Michael, I saw the clip online. You're amazing." The judges were crying. He blinked, surprised. He hadn't expected anyone outside the small audience to see the performance so soon. Then more messages began to arrive, from old friends, neighbors, and fellow soldiers. Everyone had watched the video that had been secretly recorded during the show. On social media, clips were shared rapidly. Comments poured in. "This is the most moving thing I have ever seen. A true tribute to our fallen heroes." Even the judges couldn't hold back tears. "This is beautiful." Michael stared at the screen in quiet amazement. He had never sought attention. He had only played because it felt right. And yet, the world was responding, not to him, but to the music, to the emotion, and to the meaning behind it. By midday, news outlets had picked up the story. Short video segments appeared on television. National newspapers ran headlines. "Silent Soldier moves judges with violin tribute." "Tomb guard honors the fallen through music." Reporters called his hotel, asking for interviews. Michael declined politely. He didn't want fame. He only wanted the memory of the performance to honor the soldiers who had sacrificed everything. Meanwhile, the judges themselves were still affected. The retired Marine, who had tried to compose himself during the performance, admitted later in an interview that he had been crying openly for the first time in years. "I've seen hundreds of performances, but nothing ever touched me like that. It wasn't just music. It was respect. It was love. It was remembrance in its purest form," he said. The music teacher on the panel, a woman who had spent her life teaching young musicians, said, "He didn't just play notes. He told a story of service, loss, and honor." The room felt sacred. You could hear the heartbeat of every soldier who has ever stood watch. Meanwhile, back at Arlington, Michael returned to his regular duties. Each day he stood at the tomb, every motion precise, every glance calm. But now, visitors who had heard about the performance approached him differently. They didn't ask for autographs. They didn't ask for selfies. They simply nodded with quiet respect, some whispering, "Thank you for what you do." The video had traveled far and wide. People in other states watched it with tears in their eyes. Veterans called their friends and family saying, "You have to see this. This is what service means." Schools played the clip in history classes, teaching children about honor and sacrifice. Even world leaders sent messages of admiration for the soldier who had turned silence into music. But Michael remained humble. He didn't seek recognition, and he certainly didn't expect it. He played the violin because it connected him to something deeper, to his father, to the fallen soldiers, and to the promise he had made long ago. One day, as he walked through the cemetery after his shift, he noticed something new. Small items had begun to appear near the tomb. Flowers, letters, tiny flags, and even miniature violins carved from wood. Visitors had been inspired by his performance to leave symbols of respect. Michael paused, feeling a quiet warmth in his chest. These gestures were not for him. They were for the memory of all soldiers, known and unknown, and he felt honored to witness them. The show's producers reached out again, offering him a chance to perform at a national memorial event. Once more he declined. The stage had served its purpose. He didn't need another spotlight. The music had already done what it was meant to do: touch hearts, remind people of sacrifice, and give honor to the silent heroes of the nation. Yet the story didn't end there. Across the country, people began to share their own stories of service inspired by Michael's performance. Veterans wrote about the friends they had lost. Families shared memories of fathers and mothers who had served, and young musicians practiced, hoping to one day honor someone in a similar way. The ripple effect was enormous, and Michael never sought credit. He remained the silent soldier, carrying his violin with quiet dignity. At night, after returning to his room or barracks, he would play the violin softly, just as he had always done. But now there was a new sense of purpose. The music was not only a personal tribute to his father, but a gift to the world. Each note was a reminder of what mattered most: courage, service, honor, and love. Sometimes, he would close his eyes and imagine the judges' faces, the tears, the stillness, and the silent respect of the audience. He didn't feel proud. He felt grateful. Grateful that he had been able to speak without words, to honor without ceremony, and to serve without asking for recognition. The performance had shown the world that even in silence, there is strength. Even in a simple melody, there is power. And even in a single act of dedication, one person can inspire millions. Michael continued his daily routine at Arlington, but he was changed. Not in outward ways, but in the quiet understanding that music, service, and memory could exist together. Visitors sometimes left notes saying, "We saw your performance online. Thank you for reminding us what true honor means." Each note and message touched him deeply. They reminded him that the violin was never just an instrument. It was a bridge between the past and present, between the living and those who had gone before, and between a soldier and the hearts of millions who might never enter a cemetery, but could feel the meaning behind the watch. And though he continued to live simply, standing guard, performing his duties, and returning to his small room each night, Michael knew that something inside him had shifted forever. The music had done more than fill a hall or move judges to tears. It had created a legacy, one of respect, memory, and quiet, enduring inspiration. People would remember the performance for years. They would speak of the soldier who could bring tears to eyes without a word, the man who turned silence into a tribute, and the violinist who reminded a nation of what really mattered. But for Michael, the most important part was unseen. It was in the quiet moments when he opened the violin case at night, when he played softly for his father's memory, and when he stood before the tomb, knowing that he had fulfilled a promise that would last far longer than applause or headlines ever could. The story of the tomb guard and his violin had reached the world, but the music remained his private conversation with history, honor, and love, and that was enough. Months passed since that unforgettable performance. The video of Staff Sergeant Michael Evans, the tomb guard playing his violin tribute, had traveled farther than he ever imagined. It had been shared millions of times across social media, featured in newspapers, and even aired on television worldwide. But Michael never sought fame, and he never changed his daily routine. He remained at Arlington, standing his watch with the same careful precision, the same steady steps, and the same unwavering respect for the tomb of the unknown soldier. Visitors came from far and wide. Some were veterans, some were families of soldiers, and others were simply people who had heard the story of the silent soldier and wanted to see him in person. They would walk quietly along the paths, their eyes scanning the rows of white headstones until they spotted him. Michael stood perfectly still, rifle in hand, gloves white and clean, his uniform flawless. He rarely spoke. Most visitors didn't expect him to, but some would leave small gestures of appreciation: a folded flag, a letter, a single flower. Others, inspired by his performance, left tiny carved violins or small notes that read things like, "Thank you for honoring our heroes," or "Your music reminded me of what sacrifice truly means." Michael never sought these gestures, yet each one quietly filled him with warmth. He placed the letters and small tokens carefully in a drawer in his barracks, keeping them as reminders of the connection he had forged, through music, through service, and through respect. One autumn afternoon, a group of schoolchildren visited Arlington. They were led by their teacher, who had shown them the viral video of Michael's performance. As they walked among the headstones, they paused to watch him standing guard. "Look," whispered one boy, "that's the soldier from the video, the one who played the violin." Michael noticed the group, and for a brief moment he allowed himself to smile. Not the wide smile of a performer, but a quiet, gentle one. He remembered the boy he had been, sitting on the porch with his father, learning to play the violin. He remembered the promise he had made to honor his father and the fallen soldiers, and he realized that somehow his quiet act had inspired a whole new generation. The schoolchildren listened as their teacher explained the significance of the tomb of the unknown soldier, of the honor and duty represented by Michael's watch, and of the music that had touched the hearts of millions. When Michael picked up his violin to play for the children, he didn't need a stage or cameras. The open sky, the rows of headstones, and the attentive faces before him were enough. He drew the bow across the strings, and the same gentle, sorrowful, yet proud melody of the last watch filled the air. The children sat silently, captivated. They didn't need to understand every note. They felt the emotion in the music. Some closed their eyes, others wiped a small tear, and a few whispered to each other, "It's so beautiful." After the final note, Michael set down the violin and nodded to the children. They clapped softly, some unsure of how to respond to such quiet dignity. He gave a small salute, then returned to his regular guard duties. To him, the act of playing had not been a performance. It had been a conversation with the past, a way to teach respect, and a moment to honor the lives that had been lost. Soon after, Michael received an unexpected letter. It came from one of the judges from the original show, the retired Marine. The letter was simple, handwritten, and heartfelt. It read, "Sergeant Evans, I have thought of your performance every day since that night. You reminded me and everyone who saw it of what it truly means to serve. You did not play for recognition. You played for honor. You have inspired countless people, including me, to remember the silent sacrifices. Thank you for your dedication, your courage, and your music. Sincerely, Colonel James Thompson." Michael read the letter several times. He carefully placed it in the drawer with the other letters and tokens. To him, it was not just a message from a judge. It was proof that music and service could touch hearts in ways that words alone never could. Months turned into a year, and the memory of the performance continued to ripple outward. Veterans organizations invited Michael to small memorial events, but he always declined. He never wanted to become a public figure. His life had meaning without applause. Standing guard, honoring the fallen, and quietly playing his violin when he could. That was enough. One cold winter morning, as Michael walked to the tomb of the unknown soldier, snowflakes drifted softly from the sky. The cemetery was quiet, peaceful, and pristine under a blanket of white. As he stood at his post, he noticed a young woman placing a single red rose at the base of the tomb. She looked up at him and whispered, "Thank you for reminding us why we remember." Michael nodded silently. That was all he needed. Acknowledgement not for himself, but for the countless soldiers who had given everything. He knew that their memory lived on, not just in ceremonies or in history books, but in hearts and minds across the nation. At night, he returned to his barracks and picked up the violin once more. The melody of the last watch poured from the strings soft and steady. He closed his eyes and imagined the countless faces of the soldiers he had honored, the unknown, the forgotten, and the families waiting for them. Each note was a salute, each pause a moment of respect, each rise and fall a heartbeat of remembrance. As he played, he felt his father's presence. Thomas Evans had passed many years ago, but the bond between father and son was unbroken. Music had become the bridge between the past and present, between life and memory. Michael realized that the true power of his performance had never been the applause, the judges' tears, or the viral video. It was the quiet connection it created, a reminder that honor is timeless, sacrifice is eternal, and music can speak when words fail. One evening, a young violinist sent him a message. She had watched the video countless times and was inspired to continue her own musical journey. She wrote, "Your music showed me that music is not just about notes, but about love, respect, and memory." "Thank you." Michael read the message and smiled quietly. This was the legacy he had never sought, a chain of inspiration that would continue far beyond him. Years later, when Michael retired from active duty, he continued to visit Arlington. He no longer wore the tomb guard uniform, but he carried his violin everywhere. He would sit under the trees by the headstones and play for visitors who asked, for school children learning history, or for veterans quietly reflecting on their service. People would stop to watch, often moved to tears, but Michael played not for them, but for the memory of all the soldiers who had stood watch, fought bravely, and never returned home. He had become a living testament, a man who combined service, music, and love in one simple, quiet life. In the end, the story of the tomb guard and his violin became more than a viral video or a televised performance. It became a symbol of humanity, remembrance, and honor. It showed the world that even in silence, one person could speak volumes, and that even a single melody could carry the weight of history. And as Michael Evans played his final notes at the end of each day, he knew that he had fulfilled the promise he made to his father long ago. He had honored the fallen, inspired the living, and kept the music alive, not for glory, not for fame, but for love, memory, and the quiet dignity of service. He was a soldier. He was a musician. He was a guardian of memory. And through his violin, he had shown the world that even in the simplest acts there can be extraordinary courage, beauty, and heart.